July 23, 1983, Air Canada's Boeing 767-233 operated scheduled domestic flight AC-143 on the Montreal-Ottawa-Edmonton route. There were 8 crew members and 61 passengers on board. But shortly after taking off from Ottawa Airport, at 39,000 feet, the airliner ran out of fuel and both engines stopped. The day before, on July 22, 1983, an Air Canada Boeing 767 had undergone scheduled inspections at Edmonton. The technician discovered a faulty fuel gauge system, so he turned off the faulty channel, labeled it with a special label, and made an entry in the logbook. Because the system was running on a single channel, the technician took a reading with a float indicator to get an accurate reading of the amount of fuel. Before takeoff, the technician informed the crew leader of the problem and indicated that the amount of fuel should be checked with a float indicator. The flight went well, the fuel gauges worked on the data of one channel. In Montreal, the crews changed. Captain Robert Pearson and co-pilot Maurice Quintal were to fly back to Edmonton via Ottawa. The replacement commander informed them of a problem with the Fuel Quantity Indication System, FQIS. Captain Pearson misunderstood his predecessor. He believed he was told that the Fuel Quantity Indication System, FQIS, was not working at all. In preparation for the flight to Edmonton, the technician decided to investigate a problem with the Fuel Quantity Indication System, FQIS. To test the system, he turned on the second FQIS channel. The indicators in the cockpit stopped working. At that moment, he was called to measure the amount of fuel in the tanks. Being distracted, he forgot to turn off the second channel, but he did not remove the label from the switch. From that moment on, the FQIS fuel quantity indication system did not work at all. Upon entering the cockpit, Captain Pearson saw the fuel gauges and a marked switch inoperative. He consulted the list of the minimum required equipment, minimum equipment list, MEL, and found out that in this condition the aircraft was not suitable for departure. However, at that time, the Boeing 767 was a very new aircraft. In a short period of operation, 55 corrections had already been made to the list of minimum required equipment, and some pages were still empty, because the corresponding procedures had not yet been developed. Due to the unreliability of the list information, a procedure for the approval of each flight by technical personnel was put into practice. Pearson saw a signed maintenance log authorizing the takeoff. Before the flight, 2 technicians and 2 pilots worked on the calculation in Montreal. One technician stopped after finding that he wasn't making any progress. Another technician used a piece of paper he had in his pocket and stopped when he ran out of space. Co-pilot Quintal did the calculations by hand, while Captain Pearson checked the arithmetic with a slide rule. However, in their calculations, they used the jet fuel density in pounds per liter, not kilograms per liter. Since the FQIS fuel quantity display system was not working, the commander entered readings into the flight control computer, FMC, which kept track of the amount of fuel remaining in kilograms. The plane flew without incident to Ottawa, where another manual measurement was taken. Since the plane had enough fuel to get to Edmonton, the plane was not refueled in Ottawa. Departing from Ottawa, Boeing 767 took the cruising level. At an altitude of 39,000 feet, an alarm sounded unexpectedly, warning of low pressure in the fuel system of the left engine. The onboard computer showed that there was more than enough fuel, but its readings were based on erroneous information entered into it. Both pilots decided that the fuel pump was faulty and turned it off. Since the tanks are located above the engines, under the influence of gravity, the fuel had to flow into the engines without pumps, by gravity. But a few minutes later, a similar signal from the right engine sounded, and the pilots decided to change course to Winnipeg, the nearest suitable airport. A few seconds later, the port engine cut out and they began to prepare for landing on one engine. While the pilots were trying to start the left engine and were negotiating with Winnipeg, the engine failure acoustic signal sounded again, accompanied by another additional sound signal, a long thumping sound of boom. Both pilots heard this sound for the first time, since it had not been heard before during their work on simulators. It was a failure of all engines signal. The aircraft was left without power, and most of the instrument panels on the panel went out. By this point, the plane had already descended to 28,000 feet, heading for Winnipeg. The shutdown of both engines led to a complete blackout of the aircraft's electrical system. The pilots were left with only backup devices, autonomously powered from the onboard battery, including the radio station. The situation was aggravated by the fact that the pilots found themselves without a very important device, a variometer that measures vertical speed. In addition, the pressure in the hydraulic system dropped, since the hydraulic pumps were also driven by engines. However, the design of the aircraft was designed for the failure of both engines. The emergency turbine was automatically released, driven by the oncoming airflow. Theoretically, the electricity generated by it should be enough for the plane to maintain controllability during landing. The captain flew the gliding aircraft, and the co-pilot immediately began looking in the emergency instructions for a section on piloting an aircraft without engines, but there was no such section. Luckily, the captain was a glider pilot, and as a result, he had some flying skills that commercial airline pilots don't normally use. He knew that in order to reduce the rate of descent, the optimal gliding rate must be maintained. He maintained a speed of 220 knots, assuming that the optimal glide speed should be about this. The co-pilot began to calculate whether they would reach Winnipeg. He used the backup mechanical altimeter readings to determine the altitude, and the distance traveled was reported to him by the controller from Winnipeg, determining it by the movement of the aircraft mark on the radar. The liner lost 5,000 feet of altitude after flying 11 miles. The controller and co-pilot concluded that AC-143 would not make it to Winnipeg. Then, as a landing site, the co-pilot chose the Gimli Air Base, where he had previously served. He did not know that the base was closed by that time, and the runway number 32 left, on which they decided to land, was converted into a car racing track, and a powerful dividing barrier was placed in the middle of it. On this day, a family holiday of the local car club was held there. Races were held on the former runway, and there were many people. In the beginning twilight, the runway was illuminated by lights. The air turbine did not provide enough pressure in the hydraulic system for a regular landing gear extension, so the pilots tried to extend the landing gear in an emergency. The main landing gear came out normally, but the nose gear came out, but did not lock. Shortly before landing, the captain realized that the plane was flying too high and too fast. He dropped the speed of the aircraft to 178 knots, and to lose altitude he took a maneuver, sliding onto the wing. The pilot presses the left pedal and turns the steering wheel to the right or vice versa, while the aircraft quickly loses speed and altitude. However, this maneuver reduced the speed of rotation of the emergency turbine, and the pressure in the hydraulic control system dropped even more. Pearson was able to withdraw the aircraft from the maneuver almost at the last moment. The plane descended onto the runway. The riders and spectators began to scatter from it. When the landing gear wheels touched the runway, the commander applied the brakes. The tires instantly overheated, the emergency valves bled the air out of them, the unsecured nose landing gear folded, the nose touched the concrete, carving a trail of sparks, the starboard engine nacelle caught on the ground. People managed to leave the strip, and the captain did not have to roll out the plane from it, saving people on the ground. The plane came to a stop less than 100 feet from the audience. A small fire started in the nose of the aircraft, and the command was given to begin the evacuation of passengers. Because the tail was up, the slope of the inflatable ladder in the rear emergency exit was too high. Several people received minor injuries, but no one was seriously injured. The fire was soon extinguished by motorists with dozens of handheld fire extinguishers. 2 days later, the plane was repaired on the spot and was able to fly from Gimli. After an additional renovation costing about $1 million, the aircraft was returned to service. On January 24, 2008, the aircraft was sent to a storage base in the Mojave Desert. The Aviation Safety Board of Canada said that Air Canada management was responsible for corporate and equipment deficiencies. In their report, they praised the flight crew for their professionalism and craftsmanship. It notes that Air Canada has neglected to clearly and specifically assign responsibility for calculating the amount of fuel in an emergency. It was further determined that the airline had failed to reallocate the task of checking the fuel load, which was the responsibility of the flight engineer on older aircraft flying with a crew of 3. The Safety Commission also said that Air Canada needed to keep more spare parts, including those to replace the bad fuel indicator, in its maintenance inventory, and provide better and more thorough metric training for its pilots and fueling staff.